morning, a good day, colleagues, as you join in from all corners of the world. My name is Bongiwe, Project Coordinator to the Africa-China Reporting Project in Johannesburg, South Africa. I greet you all and thank you for joining us for this webinar on interpreting data and data sources, tracking China's overseas lending, development finance, and global energy finance databases. It is a great honor to have you all, and we trust that this webinar will be highly beneficial, providing you with key knowledge and information on databases on China, as well as practical skills of accessing, using, and interpreting data sources. We're very pleased to be holding this collaboration with the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, exploring their in-depth public global China databases. The Global Development Policy Center manages and updates these databases in a bid to provide transparent information to aid research, education, policymaking, journalism, and accountability when it comes to China's overseas development finance and projects around the world. Publishing this data supports in analyzing trends and events to understand China's overseas economic activities. And these data projects are resourceful in that they guide and assist professionals to discover more about China's overseas lending in an interactive and engaging way. So it is truly a privilege to be realizing this initiative with the Global Development Policy Center, as it is a core objective of the Africa-China Reporting Project since its establishment in 2009 to contribute towards improving the quality of reporting on African and Africa-China relations. And this is accorded with the provision of facilitation and capacity building opportunities to journalists, media professionals, and academia. And through reporting grants opportunities, skills training tools, resources, training workshops, and forums, this is realized. So the Africa-China Reporting Project is driven by its aims to amplify Africa's perspectives to enhance its development within engagements with global players. So this webinar will be exploring what the status of China's overseas lending is and how can reporters use data to analyze the impacts of Chinese development projects and to tell unique stories, and what can spatial analysis of Chinese development projects reveal about impacts on sensitive territories. So attendees are welcome to present their questions or comments within the Q&A and chat functions here on Zoom. And you can also share live tweets and Facebook posts to our social media accounts at WITS China Africa Reporting Project on Facebook and at WITS China Africa on Twitter. And we're very excited by the global reach and interest that has been received by this webinar, with attendees that are joining in from countries across the globe, including, to mention just a few, the UK, Brazil, Pakistan, Italy, USA, Hong Kong, China, India, and from countries in Africa, including Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, and of course in South Africa. And the list is presented on the screen. So we welcome you all and we thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your participation. I will now hand over to Maureen Haight, Assistant Director and Communications and Outreach at Boston University Global Development Policy Center, to introduce our speakers and to lead them to their presentations. Thank you, Maureen, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for joining us today for this webinar workshop hosted by the Africa-China Reporting Project and the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center advancing policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is Maureen Haight, Assistant Director of Communications and Outreach at the GDP Center, where I oversee the center's strategic communications, media relations, digital media, and email and event marketing. Today, I am joined by three of my colleagues and lead researchers on China's overseas lending and development finance. They are Cecilia Springer, the Assistant Director of our Global China Initiative, Rebecca Ray, Senior Academic Researcher, and Oyen Tarela-Do Moses, our Data Analyst and Database Manager with the Global China Initiative. So in today's session, Rebecca and Tarella will present key findings from 3 of our databases, as well as their thoughts on what's next for China's overseas lending and development finance. Tarella will then provide a demonstration of how to use each of our databases, and following that, we will open the floor for Q&A. But first, I will pass to my colleague Cecilia, who will provide an overview of the Global China Initiative and its data work.
Thank you, Maureen. As Maureen mentioned, I'm the Assistant Director of our Global China Initiative, and our mission is to examine the extent to which China's overseas engagement fosters environmental sustainability, human well-being, and financial stability. And to that end, we have several different research groups exploring the local and global impacts of China's overseas engagement, as well as examining some of the drivers and political economy behind how China engages with the rest of the world. But today, I'd like to share screen and get our presentation started about one of our research groups in particular, which is the DATA group, or Data Analysis for Transparency and Accountability. And the goal of this group is really in its name. We aim to create accessible and comprehensive tools for a wide audience, including journalists, policymakers, academics, etc., around the world. And so I'm going to introduce first briefly a little bit more about this group and what it does. We maintain a suite of 5 interactive public databases that track various aspects of China's overseas engagement. And they are listed here. First is our China's Overseas Development database, China's Overseas Development Finance Database, or CODF. And this tracks lending commitments from China's development finance institutions, namely the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, to sovereign borrowers around the world. And this database is really the foundation of all of our work. It's global in scope. But we do have 2 regional databases, the Chinese Loans to Africa database and the Chinese Loans to Latin America and the Caribbean database, that break down regional trends in China's overseas engagement. And then we also have 2 sectoral databases that focus on the energy sector. Our China's Global Energy Finance database tracks upstream and downstream parts of the energy sector, and China's development finance to those activities. And then our China's Global Power database zooms in on power plants in particular that are receiving Chinese finance and investment. So to dig a little bit deeper into the structure and scope of our databases, as I mentioned, we are most interested in tracking development finance from Export-Import Bank of China and China Development Bank. This means lending commitments, and this underpins, as you can see, all of our databases. Our Chinese Loans to Africa database does also include other lenders on the Chinese side, including Chinese commercial banks, companies, aid agencies, etc. And then our China's Global Power database also includes information on foreign direct investment from individual Chinese companies, to paint sort of a broader picture about the types of finance and investment that these power plants are receiving. And it also tracks, rather than dollar amounts, the associated electric generating capacity of these power plants, and it also estimates their CO2 emissions. And just to share a little bit about our basic approach to collecting all of this information for hundreds and thousands of observations of Chinese engagement around the world, we combine a manual and algorithmic data collection approach, meaning that we utilize web scraping, as well as an incredible team of researchers and research assistants to conduct manual web searches and review of publicly available sources and reports. And we strive for a standard term to double verification, which means that for each project that we're checking that there are multiple verification sources, one in Chinese language, as well as an international source, such as from the host country where the project is located. And we also thoroughly assess the credibility of these sources in building our final data sets. These are updated and checked annually. So what makes our databases unique based on what I've shared about their scope and how we collect the information? First is that they are as up to date as possible. Throughout each year, we're constantly gathering information and updating, striving to release this with information for the year or two prior. We also focus on development finance. As I mentioned, this is lending commitments from China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China to sovereign borrowers in other countries. This means that we're tracking public and publicly guaranteed loans, ensuring that they're comparable to, for example, World Bank data. We also individually geolocate projects in the China's Overseas Development Finance database that have a physical footprint. And as you'll see in a moment, this enables a large range of types of analysis to understand the impacts of these projects. And we also, as you'll see with a demonstration later, have interactives that are very digestible and easy to use for anybody, where you can both visualize the data on the spot as well as download the information for later analysis. And these releases are also accompanied with policy briefs that summarize the latest trends for a wide audience. So speaking of trends, I will turn it over to my colleague, Rebecca Ray, to discuss some of our latest findings.
Thank you, Cecilia. I'll walk through some of the latest findings from the China's Overseas Development Finance database, which Cecilia mentioned at the beginning. This database covers lending from China's two major development finance institutions, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, which are comparable in their mission to the World Bank, regional development banks, and national development banks around the world. Because of this data definition, we can compare it to World Bank lending, development finance that countries are used to receiving over the last several decades around the world. And so these charts give you a few comparison points between China's DFI lending and World Bank lending around the world. On the left, we'll see in red these two Chinese DFI finance commitments, and in blue, World Bank finance commitments from 2008, the last global business cycle peak, to 2021. As you can see, in the early years of the Belt and Road Initiative from 2013 through about 2017, Chinese lending outpaced the World Bank lending significantly, but it has fallen dramatically since that time, while World Bank lending has continued to increase during the pandemic years. On the right, we see the sector distribution of the two different sources of development finance. And of course, what stands out in this graph is that big blue bar right in the middle, showing that World Bank lending is overwhelmingly concentrated in these traditional public administration sectors of health, education, institutional capacity building, and so forth. Whereas Chinese development finance in the red bars are much more heavily concentrated in industry and infrastructure projects. So countries appear to be going to both lenders, but for different kinds of projects. Next slide, please. Here we see a geographic distribution of where countries are going for their development finance needs around the world. We see it ranged in a spectrum, or in a gradation, from blue, countries that borrow from the World Bank but have not borrowed from China's DFIs during this period, and in dark red, countries that have borrowed from China's DFIs but not the World Bank in this time period. And of course, what stands out here is that most countries are in the middle. Most countries are borrowing from both. On the left, there's a distribution graph showing how many countries fall into each category. And of the countries that borrow from China that have any red in them at all, or from the lighter blue through the dark red, there's 100 of those countries, and 72 of them fall in those middle categories of borrowing either about the same from each or borrowing significantly more from the World Bank. So that means that overall, countries are approaching China as a supplement or a complement to what they're used to getting from the World Bank. Rather than choosing between these sources, most countries look at these options and say yes to both, but for different purposes. Now, here I have 4 countries in particular that are highlighted: Brazil, Argentina, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. I have these countries highlighted because they're 4 of China's top borrowers. Together, they comprise about 15% of all of these Chinese DFI's sovereign lendings. And as you can see, all 4 of them are right in that middle category. The Latin American 2 borrow slightly more from China, whereas the Asian 2 borrow slightly more from the World Bank. But generally speaking, even China's top borrowers here are choosing to borrow from both of these sources, but for very different kinds of projects. As I said, industry and infrastructure from China, health, education, and public services from the World Bank. The fact that Chinese lending is so heavily concentrated in projects that have geographic footprints, industrial, energy, infrastructure projects, means that it's so important to pay attention to the social and environmental implications of where these projects go. Next slide, please, Cecilia. And for that reason, we track the overlap of project footprints of all of the projects that are geographically located, that have specific physical presences like roads, or factories, or reservoirs, with 3 kinds of socially and environmentally sensitive territory around the world. We see here how much of China's committed finance are going into projects with each kind of sensitive territory overlap. In red are critical habitats. These are areas that have been identified by conservation biologists around the world as critical for conservation globally. In tan, there's indigenous peoples' lands, and in blue, there are national protected areas. Now, this is not all of the kinds of sensitive territory, of course, that are important around the world, and in particular national contexts, other kinds of sensitive territories will be the most important. But these 3 kinds of sensitive territories have global definitions. They mean the same thing in every country around the world. So it allows us to get a bird's eye view of global risks and how those risks have changed over time. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that those 3 bars on the left, the red, tan, and blue lines, are very different sizes. Almost half of China's finance for geographically physical projects go into projects that overlap with critical habitats, whereas only a quarter to a third go into the other 2 kinds of sensitive territories. That's not because critical habitats make up a larger share of the world's territory. In fact, it's about the same amount as protected areas. The difference is that national governments, by definition, protect protected areas. And this shows you really the importance of host country governance over the environmental and social aspects of Chinese development finance. Because China relies on host countries to set and oversee and manage these elements of a project, lands that are protected are by host country law, are much more likely to be respected in the project development than not necessarily protected, but also critical areas. Now, over the last 5 years, as I showed you, lending from China's DFIs has fallen dramatically. And as that has happened, the average size of each loan has also shrunk, and the physical size has shrunk as well. China has shifted towards a framework that analysts are calling small is beautiful, focusing on more targeted, hopefully well thought out projects. So while on the right here, there's a Venn diagram of how all of the projects are distributed across all of these kinds of sensitive territories, we can see over the whole time period, only about 36% of projects didn't overlap with any of these kinds of sensitive territories. But in the last 5 years, as China has switched towards smaller, more targeted support, towards more pinpointed projects, this has actually flipped. And in the last 5 years, only about a third of China's finance has gone into projects that are in sensitive territories. So we may be seeing a shift away from the early BRI projects that were very large in scale, that overlapped often many kinds of environmentally and socially sensitive territories, towards smaller, more targeted support for projects that hopefully will be better managed. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Tyrella Moses, to walk us through some of the results from our other 2 databases that we'll highlight today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. So I just wanted to highlight from a regional perspective some of the trends that the previous database showed us. So similar to the China's Overseas Development Finance, our Chinese Loans to Africa database also shows this decreasing trend where there was a height or a peak of lending in 2016 to African governments, and then this has since decreased to its lowest, or one of its lowest, in 2020 of to 1.9 billion in that year. However, despite this decreasing trend since 2016, we still see that Chinese financiers have provided significant finance to African governments. We have found a total of 1,188 loan commitments worth 160 billion from Chinese financiers to African governments over the course of 2000 to 2020. When you look at this graph and remove Angola from it, who has received significant finance for many of its state-owned companies, this peak of finance actually goes from 2016 to 2013. And so, as you can see, this trend has very much, the height of Chinese loans to Africa was more so in the early 2000s, close to the 2010s as well. When we break this down and look at the lenders and kind of sectors as well, I think you can also see the drivers behind this trend that we're seeing of decreasing finance. So to my top right here, you'll see that the borrowers that we look at in the Chinese Loans to Africa database actually extend beyond the two development finance institutions covered in the Chinese Loans to Africa database. So yes, we look at the Export-Import Bank of China and the China Development Bank lending, but we also look at commercial banks as well, such as the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, the China Construction Bank, and some others. And we also look at CIDCA, which is China's aid agency, as well as Chinese companies that are typically also contractors on several of these projects that are financed. And when you look at this breakdown across different lending financiers, you see that the decrease is for the most part driven by these two large lenders, Chexim and CDB, showing that in 2020, you didn't really see much of any China Development Bank lending, even though you still saw a prominence of Export-Import Bank of China lending. However, we're also seeing a decrease that happened from Chinese companies and other financiers. So it's not just the DFIs that are necessarily decreasing in their lending, but other financiers for the time being. And then if you look to my bottom left, you'll be able to see some of the trends in the sectors that are targeted, which is very similar to what we're also seeing in the China's Overseas Development Finance database, where transport and power tends to be financed, and this may be this high volume of finance that goes to these two sectors may just be that these sectors tend to have more of the higher amount projects that are larger in scope. But we've also seen that finance to the mining sector has decreased specifically since 2016 quite significantly. And then at the same time, we have seen more of a steady prominence of support for the ICT sector. So we also wanted to provide some examples of this targeted approach and sustainable approach that Rebecca also mentioned in the Africa region. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, in 2020, and also from our CODF database in 2021, we did see that China Development Bank, according to our data, did not provide any finance to African lenders. At the same time, we also saw that China Exim has also shown some reluctance to finance large transport projects throughout the region. So in Nigeria, we've seen a reluctance to finance future railways. In Uganda, there was a recent cancellation from the Ugandan government of a contract for the standard gauge railway that they were previously in discussions with China Exim. And then we've also seen China Exim be reluctant to disperse certain amounts of loans that were already committed to avoid increasing debt burdens in Ethiopia. This move from larger amounts of financing to smaller projects can also be seen in when we look at the case of Uganda. In 2015, we saw that China Exim signed 3 different projects, or signed 3 different loan commitments for projects in the transport and power sectors. And this amounted to $1.6 billion according to our loan commitment data. In 2020, however, there was only 1 agreement signed, and that was almost $500 million for an oil roads project in obviously the transport sector. But this loan signing was more of a result of parliamentary approval that happened in 2019, and that came late in the year. And so the loan signing was able to proceed. So you see this vast difference between this 1.6 billion in the earlier years and significantly less now in the year of 2020 and 2021. Next slide, please. When you come to our sectoral databases, more specifically the China's Global Energy Finance database, we also see the same decreasing trend, even despite the large significance of China's development finance for this sector as well. So we know that from 2000 to 2021, CDB and China Exim contributed 235 billion in loans to foreign governments in the energy sector. We saw a peak of this lending in 2009, and this is mostly due to the support for oil and gas projects in Russia. We saw this peak again or high amount in 2016. Again, I think this 2016 height can be explained by support for Angola. And then in 2021, we found no loan commitments from CDB and Chexim to the energy sector. Next slide, please. So as we're seeing these trends, we thought and put some context around future trends that we could see for China's development finance from these 2 institutions, CDB and the Export-Import Bank of China. We do anticipate that the development finance could rise, but whether or not it rises again, given the capacity that China has right now with current account surpluses, whether or not this development finance rises, we do expect a diversification of finance and financing tools and new ways to provide finance to various regions and sectors. One of those additional tools could be in the form of equity finance, where we could see more Chinese companies contributing to projects, but we could also see financing from China's overseas development investment funds. So we recently wrote a paper on these equity funds that are pools of capital established by public and private entities to primarily provide equity finance to projects with often with a developmental purpose. An example of this is the Silk Road Fund, which was established by the China Development Bank, the China Exim Bank, and 2 of China's sovereign wealth funds. And they have already provided significant amount of financings for several development projects. Overall, these ODIFs, as we call them, have a capitalization of $155 billion. This is not a full dispersed amount. It just tells us the capacity of how much financing that they could potentially provide to different regions and sectors. We've also seen a mention of credit being funneled to regional banks, mentioned in the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Dakar Action Plan as well. So we could see that this is also a new avenue or a new kind of financial tool in the form of on-lending that could be added to the toolbox for providing support for development projects across the world. And so next slide, please. That concludes our presentation about the overall trends, and I will briefly walk us through how to use our databases. So please give me a moment while I share my screen. I trust that everyone can see it well. Okay, so let's just begin with the China's Overseas Development Finance database. When you come to this database with the link to the CODF database, you'll be met with a background screen that just provides brief information about the database. You can scroll down to continue to read more about how we put the database together, as well as overall trends. But you can also click Explore and go straight into the database to interact with the map that you see here. So this map shows projects that are largely geolocated in our China's Overseas Development Finance database. Right now, you're looking at a map with several icons, and you can hover over those icons to get quick information about the specific projects, such as the year, the lender, the sector, and the amount. You could also hover over here to the square box and create a square over a certain area in the on the map, and it quickly zooms into that area so that you can see multiple projects in a specific country or region of interest. So let me hover over this here and click the globe to give us more of a global view, and head on over to my left to this legend to explain how you can use it to interact with the map. So this map shows us several finance projects that overlap with sensitive territories that Rebecca mentioned in her part of the presentation. So when you click and interact with these checkboxes, you'll be able to see the projects that overlap with these sensitive territories, such as the Indigenous Peoples' Lands territory, the potential critical habitats, national protected areas as well. You can also hover over here and click in this checkbox to see the actual map layer that provides a spatial representation of that sensitive territory. So you could look at the projects that overlap with the Indigenous Peoples' Lands and see the Indigenous Peoples' Lands spatial representation on the map. I could do this for all the different sensitive territories that we have here, and give kind of a full representation of all the mapped projects that we found overlapped with sensitive territories. So let me just click out here to give us a clear map view and remove the map layers. If you scroll down, this graph also provides quick information about the number of loans as well as the amount, loan amounts that are provided over the course of this database's time period. If I scroll down further, I can then see each loan provided in detail. And so here we have listed our loan commitments with the purpose or project names, as well as the year the loan was signed, the amount of the loan, the lender, the borrower, sector, and the associated sensitive territory overlap if known. So if I click over one of these projects, let me see here if I can find one. I can then use this click function to quickly just find the project on the map. So let me unclick here to unlock this, zoom back out, and then I will quickly show you how you can download this background data. So in addition to being able to interact with the map, you can also download this data in Excel form. If you scroll down this About Data Download page, you'll be able to see a form that you can fill out to put in your background information, and we'll send you a link with the data. You can also access another version of this map that is password protected that provides geographic kind of footprint visualization of the different projects. So for example, if there is a road, you'll be able to see the length of the road and what cities it goes between. So that's another option that you can access through reaching out to me via email and also submitting your information to download the database. If you scroll up here, you'll be able to get access to our policy briefs. This, again, provides just contextual information about the trends and is able to kind of just provide an overview of how we see our data being explained in the grander scheme of China in the world. So let me come out of this view here and switch over to the next database, which is the Chinese Loans to Africa database. So this project is also an interactive that is able to give you quick trends about the data. So again, similar to the China's Overseas Development Finance database, this database, when you log in, provides quick background information about the database. Or you could just click and explore the data to go straight to the map. So when you come in, it'll just give you some quick instructions of how to interact with the map. And you'll first be met with a map of the continent of Africa and a visual representation of how much finance has been provided from different Chinese financiers and different sectors as well. So these different bar graphs, again, show the amount of finance, and the colors show the sectors that are associated with each amount. If I just wanted to look at one country, such as Angola here, I can just click into the map to give me a visual representation of Angola, and that adjusts the sector graph as well as the year graph to show me what sectors finance was provided for in Angola, and also what the year breakdown looks like. If I scroll down, there's also a list of loan commitments that we have that have their associated projects, the year, the lender, and the amount allocation as well. And this list adjusts based on how you interact with the map. So for example, if I was going to look at some of China's top borrowers, so we have Angola here we have Zambia, Ethiopia, and if we moved over to Ghana, and let's just add Nigeria as well, all of the different aspects of this interactive will adjust to give you quick information about all of those different countries at one time. So the sector graph has adjusted, the year graph has adjusted, and the list below here has adjusted as well. And I can click in to see the specific loan commitment and get background data about that loan commitment. So let me scroll back up here and reset my map and just quickly show you this regional loans icon right here. This is an icon that talks about just regional loans to regional institutions such as the African Export-Import Bank, the African Development Bank, and other regional institutions as well. So it's not just finance to African countries, but also their regional institutions. And this icon here gives a little bit more explanation of what we mean. You can also interact with this map by looking at the lenders. And again, if you click up here, the map adjusts to show you the different types of lenders that we talk about. So when we say policy banks, we also mean development finance institutions, which just refers to China Exim and China Development Bank. And then we also look at commercial banks, which I mentioned earlier, can range from Bank of China to Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, also known as ICBC. And we look at Chinese contractors and other Chinese lenders, as well as other Chinese government lenders. So again, you could do the same thing and interact with this map to specifically look at lenders and compare lenders across 2 different countries. So if we looked at Angola, we do see that there's a significant amount of policy bank or development bank finance that goes into Angola. But then if we look at Ghana alone, we see that there's a higher amount of what we would call commercial finance from commercial banks, but also Chinese companies when you compare it to Angola, even though the policy banks still provide a majority of the finance. So let's reset the map here and just go up to our About Data download page. And similar to the CODF database, you could do the same here to download the data by scrolling down to this sheet right here and just fill in your information. And we'll send a link so you can download the Excel file to just interact with the data on your own. And then if you scroll back up here, we also have a policy brief to provide more detailed information beyond what I provided on the context behind the data trends we discussed. Okay, and let me go to our last data set that we'll talk about today, the China's Global Energy Finance data set. So this data set is slightly different from the other 2, but I'll just provide an overview of how to interact with this database is interactive as well. So similar to the other 2, when you first log in, you'll get background information about the highlights of the data trends from the CGEF database. And you can click Explore to go immediately in. You'll see a map that has different color gradients that kind of gives you an indication of how much finance has been provided to certain countries and regions. So you could start by clicking into a country to get, again, quick information about that specific country. You could look at the energy sources that were supported for the overall globe, or just a specific region as well. And you can also look at energy subsectors listed here, as well as the different types of lenders, which are just these 2 lenders, as well as co-financing between the 2 lenders. So if I go back to locations, like I said earlier, if we wanted to just look at one country, the map changes and we can scroll down to look at the year breakdown for that country, as well as the types of projects split by different energy sources, and also split by different energy subsectors as well. So that's just a quick overview of this database. One more thing I'll show you, just so you have an understanding of this feature, is the difference between total global and total BRI. So when we say total global, these are just, again, all the finance that has been provided from China Development Bank the Export-Import Bank of China to countries across the globe for the energy sector. And then when we say total BRI, we're just looking at countries that specifically have signed a Belt and Road Initiative MOU with China. And so that this amount gives us quick information about countries receiving energy finance from China that also are counted in the BRI, so to speak. So for this database, you can go to the About page to also submit a form to download the data and download an Excel file. And then if you scroll up, you'll also be able to access policy briefs that, again, provide much more granular information beyond what we shared with you today about the CGEF database. If you have any questions about these databases, you please feel free to reach out to me at odm@bu.edu. If there are any technical issues as well, you can also reach out to me at that email. And if you have any media inquiries, you can also reach out to Maureen Height, who is on our call today. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Please let us know if you have any questions. We look forward to a great discussion and conversation.
Thank you so much, Tarela. That is such a comprehensive database. And thank you to the rest of our speakers, Rebecca and Cecilia, for sharing that very crucial information. I'm sure everyone is as blown away as I am in terms of what information we can access and how we can make sense and interpret the data that is available. So I'm just going to go straight into the Q&A to the questions that have been provided by the attendees. I guess the first one speaks to the decreasing trend that we are seeing with China's lending in African countries and I guess globally. This is specific to Angola, Kenya, it's specific to Nigeria and Uganda. And the question is, why is China hesitant to finance large transportation infrastructure projects in Nigeria and Uganda, but eager to do so in Angola, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa? Do their loan contract terms vary by country, or what is the case? So I will allow you, Tarela, to respond to that, or Cecilia or Rebecca. Thank you.
Sure. So I can start with some of the cases that we listed. So for what we're seeing so far, it seems like many of these cases seem to be on a case-by-case basis. So when you look at the Uganda SGR railway, what we found is that a contract was signed for the SGR in around 2015 or so, and in that contract, an MOU was also established between the Ugandan government and the Export-Import Bank of China. And from 2015 up until earlier this year, there was negotiations that happened for several years, China Exim going back and forth with the Ugandan government. And many of the reasons for why, at least on the China Exim side, why they kept asking for a change in the application or for a request to make sure application were revised and negotiated was because there were kind of two things going on. We think that the Export-Import Bank of China was potentially concerned about commercial viability, especially because that section of the SGR was eventually supposed to connect to the Kenyan SGR if it were to be fully expanded and extended. And there were already multiple kind of shows of losses on that specific project and an inability for that project to break even. And we think that was potentially impacting kind of the perception of commercial viability for the Ugandan SGR. We also saw that in many official documents there was a mention of land rights. That was also an issue where the Export-Import Bank of China wanted the Ugandan government to make sure that land rights were at least established for the full extension of the SGR. However, the Ugandan government only, it seemed, kept saying that land rights were acquired, but it seemed that it had only acquired land rights for a specific section, which was the beginning start of the Ugandan SGR railway. So what we're seeing, again, seems to be on a case-by-case basis. At least in the Ethiopia case that we mentioned, this was just mostly a pause of disbursements that affected several transport and power projects. And that pause was because of the concern for increasing the debt burden. And then in Nigeria, were not as clear as to kind of the reasoning behind the reluctance, but originally there was an expectation that China Exim would provide 85% of finance for railway between Ibadan and Kano, and another large railway project as well. And then in the 2021 or so, we saw kind of this apprehension to start financing that, even though Nigeria had, the Nigerian government had already put down 15% of the finance. So we're seeing it more on a case-by-case basis, and I'm not sure if there's necessarily a concerted kind of trend across the African region.
Great, that makes quite good sense, I suppose. Is it possible when journalists or researchers or academics want to get that contextual understanding or that case-by-case analysis of each of the reasoning behind the data and what the data shows, can they get that from the policy briefs, perhaps, to get an understanding of what are the reasons for these patterns to be heading this way or that way?
I can answer this question if that's okay. Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what we hope everyone will do. But in those policy briefs, you'll see not only a consideration of some of these highlighted projects that help understand the broader trends, but also understand how these trends are global and not just focused on individual countries. And so, just as the question seemed to imply that China might have a preference for some countries over others, but what we're seeing is that these case-by-case concerns about bankability, legality, etc., are more likely to apply globally now than they were in the early years of the Belt and Road Initiative. So rather than seeing China pick out particular projects that it doesn't want to lend to now in particular countries, we're seeing those concerns across the board. So even countries that are among the top borrowers, like Pakistan and Argentina, who have gone to China many times for very large-scale infrastructure projects, are now finding China wanting to negotiate over and go over with a fine-tooth comb now the details of bankability, legality, etc., in a way that they was not part of the process maybe 10 years ago. And so, yes, please come follow all of those links in the chat that Maureen has provided for everyone, please, and do peruse the policy briefs for this crucial context that we're looking at global trends that I think can make more sense when we look at them from a bird's eye view and then zoom into these individual cases, just like Tarela just did. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that, highlighting the importance of the global trends within the database. Just going to go to one of our questions from Manling Yang, who's asking, in terms of the three databases which have been presented, that's China's Overseas Development Database and Chinese Loans to Africa Database and the China's Global Energy Finance Database. The question is, how much of the data from these three databases overlap with each other? And can you please give some advice of which database is more suitable for what kind of analysis? So the question basically on interpreting the findings from the data, what is specific to each and how much of them, how much of the data overlaps with each other?
I could kick us off, and then please feel free to add.
Yes, please, Tarela.
Okay, great. So very similar to what Cecilia shared at the beginning of the presentation, the underlying foundation of our databases is China's development finance from China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. And so finance from those two institutions is pretty much embedded in all of our data sets, starting with the CODF data set that provides finance from these institutions to countries across the globe. If you go to the Chinese Loans to Africa database, it has finance from those two institutions in it that is also pulled from the CODF database. but the CLA database, again, the Africa database, adds an additional set of finance from other financiers beyond the development finance institutions to generally just look at state-to-state finance. And so when we go to the China's energy finance database, that's just a depiction of energy or finance from those two institutions for just the energy sector. And so it pulls out finance of the energy sector from the larger global CODF database into the CGEF database. But the value of the CGEF database is that it breaks down what type of finance is provided for different energy sources as well as energy subsectors. So in terms of the usability of each database, the CODF database is helpful for understanding global trends, as well as comparing Chinese development finance to World Bank finance. The Chinese Loans to Africa database is helpful for understanding trends in Africa, but also trends, just general trends of government to government finance. And then the energy finance database is important for just looking at the sector of energy in general, which we have seen as just a sector that has attracted very much Chinese development finance.
Great, thank you so much, Tarela. That clarifies the different outputs that you can get from each of those data sets. Then to the next question, I'm not sure if you can answer this, but excellent database. How does this data compare to A-Data, which is also an organization that makes available these kinds of databases? Is the difference that this data includes investment deals that is financed by the state banks? Question mark. Is that suitable for you, Tarela?
Yeah, I think Cecilia could also answer this question.
Okay, Cecilia, please would you respond to that question?
Sure. So I think that our databases are unique, as I mentioned earlier, in that they have a very focused scope on China's overseas development finance, which we define as lending commitments to sovereign borrowers from the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank. And so we have this very tight focus in order to ensure the comparability of our data to the World Bank. I think another unique feature of our databases, again, is the geolocation. And so the analysis that Rebecca presented really relies on very detailed work that our team has done to verify on an individual level where the footprint of projects that have have a physical structure somewhere that they have, whether it be transmission lines or more sort of polygonal shaped projects such as manufacturing facilities. And I think that geolocation information, which Tarela showed in the mapping interactive, present a very unique and usable layer to our information. I think we're also very up to date. So you could see the years in our databases. Most of them are for the year prior to the update, so with a 1 year or 2 year time lag. I also think that the interactives are a sort of distinguishing feature. So as you've seen, anybody can go in there. The data can be downloaded, and our policy briefs, which are released along with the update of each database, also have very digestible information on the specific trends from that very recent release. I can stop there and see if anyone wants to add anything.
I'd like to add something, if that's okay.
Yes.
In addition to the database interactive that Tarela shared with everyone, the CODF database has an additional password protected version of itself that you can get access to with instructions on the website that show you the physical footprint traced out on the map of every project in the database and how they interact with each other. So the whole network of projects will show up as that network, and using those background the background map layers of where national protected areas are, for example, you could see which part of that network overlaps with that protected area. So we hope that this makes it particularly empowering for journalists, practitioners, civil society, as we all work towards better outcomes for this network of projects, to understand how they interact with each other and how risks might cascade across a network of projects. So by being as up to date as possible, and by having this visual verification of every project's footprints, that we've laid eyes on that project, and we've laid eyes on where it's going in its feasibility studies, and we've exactly laid out where that project is, we hope to be able to empower environment ministries, journalists, civil society groups to work together as these projects become reality, including those that don't exist yet but are still in the planning stage, to have the best possible outcomes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I guess this question speaks to the data collection. And the question is the data on financial commitments supported by the financial statements of individual African countries? This is important given the difference between commitment and disbursements, which is up to half sometimes.
Yes, that's a fantastic question. And so our methodology primarily desires to depend on official sources. So at least for the Chinese Loans to Africa database, the majority of those sources for the loan commitments that we have found come from Ministry of Finance documents from the various African countries included, and other types of government financial documents as well. And we double verify those documents with any Chinese official statements, whether it be from the Chinese Embassy, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, and even Chinese contractors that are involved on a specific project. So yes, we try to ensure that our databases and data within our databases are verified through official sources from the recipient side, but also as well as the lender side.
Thank you, Tarela. And just to follow up to that, there's a question that what do you do in the case that the loan commitments cannot meet the requirements of double verification? And what is the estimated size of that? Like, how often do you encounter those incidents where some commitments cannot be double verified?
Sure. So I can start, and I think some of my other colleagues could add to this as well. So again, our standard is double verification, meaning that, as I mentioned, we try to have an official source and then also another source from the lending side as well, aiming for that to be official. And in the case where we are not able to find official sources, we try to look at state media as our next kind of layer of sources to verify. And then lastly, we look at also news media as well. And we, again, try to have as much as robust sources as possible. But we also acknowledge that for those particular projects, that it is genuinely harder to find official sources. I will say that for different regions, the level of official sources that we have varies. So for the Africa region, we have official sources very much underpin most of the projects because it seems that maybe due to African government interactions with the IMF and the World Bank, there is more relatively more transparency when compared to other regions that allows Ministry of Finance and other government agencies to provide official data on debt or loan commitments that have been signed with many countries, including China.
And I can also contribute to that because, as Terele says, this is something that is more likely to be a problem outside of Africa. So more likely to be something we see in making the CODF database than the CLA database. And so in that way, it's a bit in my wheelhouse. So our ideal, the gold standard would be if there was something, an official government document from both the host country government and a Chinese official website. Barring that, if we have an official treasury or finance ministry or parliamentary document, or if it's a state-owned enterprise that's borrowing a financial statement from that state-owned enterprise, that is an audited statement, and so we can rely on that. Double verification comes into play, especially when what we have are less official sources. So if we have only, for example, a press report on the host country side, we would not rely on that as definitive unless it's also backed up with a press report from the Chinese side. If there's only a mention in a host country newspaper and absolutely nothing else, then we would not consider that reliable enough to say, we will say publicly that this loan happened. As I said, our goal is to empower stakeholders all along the management side, whether it's civil society, journalists, or government actors, or the state-owned enterprises that might be receiving the finances. And so we want to be very careful about making sure that we don't put forth any rumors of loans that haven't become reality yet, because those allegations or those rumors can really get legs. We don't want to empower people to oversee projects that don't exist. And so that is essentially our double verification means that if it is only mentioned in less than official sources on the host country side, or if it is only mentioned in less than official sources on the Chinese side, we would not consider that sufficiently verified to include in our database. We absolutely want to make sure that everything we put forth actually happened, so that we're not, especially because we have access to this password protected database where you can see the outlines of the actual projects. And so we don't want to say that a project is going into a rainforest or an indigenous territory if it isn't actually going to happen, because it hasn't actually been signed. So I hope that helps explain a little more about the process. And again, this is something that we more have to struggle with outside of Africa, because countries that have IMF agreements are more likely to have to meet certain debt transparency and financial commitment transparency obligations under their IMF agreements. And so countries that are upper middle income countries, which are more likely to be found, for example, in South America or in Eastern Europe, may not have to meet those same transparency reporting guidelines. And so in those situations, we do have to get a little creative. Myanmar, for example, is a member of the International Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which has its own reporting methods. And so there's another source of official documentation, even though the government of Myanmar doesn't exactly issue the same kind of Office of Debt Management regular reports the same way that other countries do. I hope that helps. Thanks.
That helps very much. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I'm just going to follow that up with this one question, also related to data collection. In addition to the finance activities by or between government or state-owned enterprise and mega infrastructure project, is there any loan contracts from state's financial institution to the private sectors has collect in these database only? I think that was a misspelling there, especially the manufacturing industry.
So
I hope you understand that one.
I think so. I think maybe I can clarify or verify what they were asking, but it seems they're asking, do we have lending to the private sector, mostly in the manufacturing industry, it sounds like. And the quick answer to that is no, we do not, because we focus on government recipients. And we also focus on recipients that have a majority public ownership or government ownership, or if the recipient is a private owner, and the loan that is committed has a government guarantee on it, meaning a recipient government guarantee, then we include the loan as well. So we don't really, systematically look at private lenders, but there may be in some cases where you might see a private lender, but that's because there's a government recipient government guarantee on it.
Thank you so much, Torella. And if we can maybe just speak on the question of access and availability of the database, how can researchers, journalists, and other professionals access your databases? Is there a newsletter that they can sign up for to receive the frequent updates that you release, and other initiatives that you coordinate, maybe workshops or the like? If we can maybe just speak briefly to that question. And that's to you, Torella, or Maureen, or Cecilia.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take this one. So we do have a newsletter for our Global China Initiative. I will share the link in the chat for everyone to sign up. Otherwise, we've been sharing some links in the chat that people can use to access our databases and the latest policy briefs. I'll also share the landing DATA page on our website where you can explore our other databases, including our Chinese loans to Latin America and on China's global power. So we do have more, so we'll share those links there. And as mentioned, we're also always happy to chat and answer questions. And the best way to reach us is by email. So we've shared mine and Tarella's in the chat. You can also find these on our website. And we are also on Twitter at GDP Center. So at GDP_Center.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maureen. That's very helpful information. I'm sure will be used quite widely. And also maybe in the future we can explore those additional 2 databases which we haven't looked at in this webinar, and that's for future collaborative options that we'll have with the center. Just going to take this one last question from Rahul, who's asking if there are any indicators that help measure conditionality. I think we can draw that back to Torella and Rebecca and Cecilia. Within the databases, if there are any indicators that help measure conditionality.
At least on the Chinese loans to Africa side, we don't publicly release indicators that provide any measures of conditionality. I guess, and when I say that, I mean conditionality in terms of a conditionality for the reception of certain terms and conditions, such as their interest or repayment periods. So we don't necessarily release anything like that on the Africa side. So I'll pause there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Again, I'd like to point attendees to our policy briefs that have more in-depth discussion of different aspects that we see in the trends. And so in those, for example, attendees may be aware of the recent announcement of Chinese forgiveness of interest-free loans or zero-interest loans to Africa. That kind of discussion about a particular kind of loan that has particular conditionality would be found in our policy briefs. And in fact, we have a recent policy brief looking into the implications of that announcement per se and the extent of Chinese zero-interest loans, particularly in Africa. That was on our website and that attendees might be interested in perusing. So this gets to the benefit of going beyond the data and getting into some of the qualitative analysis. Even things that may not be able to be double verified on a global scale for both high and low transparency countries can still be discussed in depth in the policy briefs. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. And as well, I guess there's that huge concern over transparency, which we've seen within the questions that we received from our attendees. So how do you deal with those kinds of situations whereby you're trying to access the data, but you find difficulty with lack of transparency? What are some of the robust methods that you implement within the databases that you publish. I understand there might be a bit of repetition there, but just to appease the question from the attendee.
This might be a question for me to jump into first, because as I said, transparency issues are more likely to be something we have to really struggle with outside of the African context. And here it's a matter of building up regional expertise in how information is disseminated in different parts of the world, which tend to have different information cultures. And so, for example, Chinese lending, Chinese development finance to state-owned enterprises and the industrial sector in Central Asian states very frequently goes through a central development bank. And so once you have enough experience of following that relationship, you'll know, okay, this is going to be reported in the financial statements of the Kazakhstan Development Bank, the comings and goings of this finance, rather than relying on the press or relying on an official statement from a finance ministry, for example, which may not report things in the same regards. And so Boston University is very fortunate to be able to draw on a global network of collaborators in academia, as stakeholders in civil society and government agencies, to be able to consult with, to understand best the information culture of different regions in the world and where best to be able to follow this information disclosure year by year by year. For example, as I said, Myanmar is a member of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and that's the kind of thing that you pick up after following that relationship for enough years to develop an institutional understanding of the information culture of that relationship. And so with that in mind, we've developed kind of an in-house data management strategy, or rather, I should say, Tarella has developed an in-house data management strategy that builds up this. And I want to give you an opportunity to chime in here as well. But I did want to give those anecdotes about particularly low transparency areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca, for addressing that. I'll allow Tarella to add on to it. And I understand Cecilia also mentioned at the beginning the DATA. So maybe she can add on to some points to that as well.
Absolutely. So very similar to what Rebecca shared about regional expertise, we find it important to make sure that we're looking at this information in various languages as well. So on our research assistant teams, we make sure that we have research assistants that not only speak English and speak English very well, but also are able to read Mandarin Chinese, French, Arabic, Urdu, Spanish, just all these languages that are important in other regions, because what we found is, yes, you may be able to get, a certain level of information in English, but many of the times on different websites, if they have different versions of their websites, they actually may have more information on the Chinese version or the French version of their website. And so we find it important to have that expertise in terms of language skills. And then we also make sure that, this double verification process, whereby we look at multiple sources, we call it forensic internet sleuthing, where we're using all various terms to go on the internet and find what we need to find, and then triangulate those sources to then confirm different aspects of a different loan commitment project. So that sleuthing comes in the form of web scraping, as we talked about, through using an algorithm to find news sources online, as well as official source manual collection, whereby we aim to look at as many official sources as we can that would give us loan commitment information for all the different regions and countries that we have in our database.
Thank you, Tarella. I'll hand over to Cecilia.
Yeah, I would just add regarding the question of sort of lack of transparency and missing information, that bringing it back to the overall goals of the DATA group, data analysis for transparency and accountability. I think one important service that our databases provide is the ability to benchmark. So while it's inevitable that there may be some missingness of information due to a lack of transparency, that once we do have a project in our data set, we keep tabs on it over time as long as it still fits into the scope of our databases. And I think that's an important service for sort of the global community interested in these topics, to be able to track over time that which is already knowable. I think also one thing that we've discussed before is that we would love to essentially be put out of business if there ends up being extremely transparent and detailed disclosure on the part of the sponsors of these projects. But since that has yet to be forthcoming, that we think that this is sort of the best service that we can provide, again, to the global community, and having sort of transparent information that we track over time. And certainly we would love this to spur user reports as well as disclosures by companies and sort of government sponsored projects that can potentially supplement and or replace this information when the time comes.
Thank you, Cecilia. I think since we don't have any further questions, we can open up for some closing remarks. Sorry, my computer is frozen. There we go. If we can just open for some quick closing remarks before we close the webinar. And if we have any itching questions from our attendees, this is your last minute to share your comments or questions to our speakers while they give their closing remarks. Shall I allow Maureen for a quick closing statement? Thanks.
Yes, thanks so much. Well, just to thank everyone for joining us today, and to mention again that we are always happy to chat and follow up offline as well with questions to our databases. I will share our contact information in the chat again, and we look forward to connecting with you soon. And with that, I'll pass to my colleague Cecilia for her thoughts.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you so much to the Africa-China Reporting Project for hosting us. I think this comes at a really timely moment in the changing nature and scope of China's overseas engagement. And so I hope that our data has been useful to a wide audience. And I would just note that we have an incredible team as well as network of partners in the Global South that have supported this work and helped us verify information and so on. So we hope to continue to build that network so we can continue to stay relevant and timely in the information that we provide.
Thank you.
I'll pass it to Tarla. Sorry.
Thank you, Cecilia, and I also want to thank the Africa-China Reporting Project for having us here. I think just from the data trends perspective, the main takeaway is that China has provided significant, development finance over the course of many years, especially from 2000 in the Africa region and context. And due to many factors, including the impacts of COVID-19, but also a shift to more of these targeted projects, we have seen development finance and generally state-to-state finance decrease. And so we are, waiting and looking at the future trends. And as we wait and look at future trends, we'll also be looking at potential other financial tools that China will be using. And so we look forward to sharing with you more information through our databases and policy briefs on the trends that we observe over time. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll finish by, again, thanking our host so much. And I hope that this is the beginning of many great conversations, both with the Africa-China Reporting Project and with all of the attendees. If you have further questions, or if you find something in one of our databases that needs to be updated, if you have information because you're a journalist and you also are tracing these loans, please feel free to contact us. We really do cherish these relationships and conversations, and we hope that this is the beginning of several new ones. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Tarela, for your inputs. the great amount of information that you've shared with us and the attendees today. It's highly important, and I'm sure everyone who's been in attendance will make use of the databases, and I absolutely appreciate the interactive nature of it all. I think it makes it much more dynamic in terms of what kind of information you're trying to make sense of. So I really appreciate the time that you've made for us and the attendees, and your expert and knowledge that you have shared with everyone else. And also, this really speaks to the understanding, the important understanding that is of China's engagement in the world, especially for the Africa-China Reporting Project, to be able to build that capacity of our network to understand these new trends within China's finance developments in the world, and what impacts and effects these deals. So really grateful for this opportunity, and definitely to echo your words, Rebecca, it is the first of many. We have seen that we can do it, so we will follow on and see if there are any other ways we can be sharing this kind of knowledge and imparting these skills to our networks. So to that, we are exactly at the half hour, so we can then close the webinar. Thank you everyone who has given the time to participate, and all those that engaged with us with your questions and your comments. Truly appreciated. And if you need any further or additional assistance, please reach out to the Global Development Policy Center, and we're also available at the Africa-China Reporting Project. And we hope that this has been very useful and will contribute very well to your future reporting on China's role in Africa and the rest of the world. And with that, thank you once more, and goodbye.